I am going to invite Sally Brown, who is our keynote, to share her screen, and Dan Goossen to come up to introduce her.
Sally, oh, there she is. Look at that. So Sally is not Sally Brown. For those of you who are unfamiliar, is a big name in the compost industry. Hopefully, many of you are aware of BioCycle, which is the industry-leading publication. It's been around for a very long time. It is no longer in print as of a couple of years ago, but it still comes to your inbox regularly if you are signed up. If you are not, you should sign up. And every month, I believe it's well, maybe it's not quite every issue, but a regular feature in that is a column from Sally Brown. Dr. Sally Brown is a research associate professor in the School of Forest Resources at the University of Washington in Seattle, where it is 3 hours earlier than it is. So thank you, Sally, for waking up early for this. And a fellow in the Soil Science Society of America. She was recently appointed to the UR. She helped with the Compost Climate Connections webinar series, which came out recently and you can still find online. And she co-authored CREF's publication, The Compost and Climate Connection, which is also available from the U.S. Composting Council. Authored dozens of published papers on the benefits of compost. And we are very happy that even though she's not able to join us in person this time, that we get to still share her face and her voice coming to us straight from Seattle. So without further ado, Dr. Sally Brown, thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me do it from my couch. I will say that I'm outside of Seattle in the mountains, but it has been snowing this morning, which is great in December, and not nearly as nice when it's almost May. So um, I'd much rather be inside now talking to you guys than outside gardening. I was first there in 2013. It was a great conference and a great visit, and I was a lot younger then. And I went back and I looked at the presentation. I thought, oh, I did a good job. Oh, wait, what else do I have to say? This is, methane from landfilling food scraps. And here it is, deja vu all over again. I'm better now at making graphs, but this is from that presentation. And basically on a dry weight basis, I said that, boy, you get a lot of methane when you landfill food scraps. And what has happened since then? EPA pieces together from a range of studies, and in this last year said, you know what? You get a lot of methane when you landfill food scraps. Now, it's really wonderful that this is a figure from EPA, and it's really wonderful because when I started with this, EPA had landfill gas collection efficiency at 100% for the life of the landfill. We've made huge progress since then. There's more progress to be made. There have been studies recently that have real-time methane measurements from landfills, and by God, they do emit methane. But the fact that WARM model now explicitly connects landfilling food scraps with methane emissions, and that WARM says close to 60% of the methane emissions from landfills come from food scraps is critical. This is a real bit of progress. Now, since I was last here, there's been a lot of water under the bridge. This is a bad pun for something that I hope was much worse in the New York Times than in reality. But climate change has hit Vermont, and I'm really sorry about that. But on a wonderful note, and this was talked about by the last speaker, you passed the law in 2012, long before EPA put pieces together, went into effect in 2020. This is from BioCycle. Congratulations. It's fabulous. And I have to get a bad Star Trek reference in here. So in much less time from when Jean-Luc first started to say, make it so, and the last season of Picard, you guys have traveled at warp speed to get this done. Sorry, but couldn't help it. Um, and based on a study at a University of Vermont, looking at how many people say, according to the survey, that food scraps are being separated from trash, the number has grown significantly. So people there are walking the walk. They're not just talking the talk, and that's pretty amazing. Another bad pun. Anybody recognize this family?
Yep. Yes.
Are the hills alive there? Come on, guys. Okay, the Von Trapp family and Julie Andrews. Anyway, according to Biocycle, we're talking about 50,000 tons of food waste annually. If you take this estimate of how many tons of CO2 equivalent from EPA for diverting food scraps, that's methane avoidance, that gives you this many tons of CO2e, 43,000, or 66 kilograms per person. So everybody can chalk that up as a personal accomplishment. 66 kilograms of CO2e just from following the rules and taking your food scraps out, which is fabulous. Now, that was a survey of what people say they do. And what people actually do and what people say they do can be different. For example, how far did you say you ran last week versus how I know this from personal, not getting into my own. Anyway, in Seattle, we've had food scrap separation for over 15 years. And it's one of the longest running and most successful programs in the country. Here's some literature from SPU, Seattle Public Utilities. Here's what we have to do to get compost right. And from a paper we recently did with someone, Kate Kurtz from Seattle Public Utilities, we looked at not what percentage participate, but estimates of those that participate, how much that could go into the compost bin actually does. And it's good, but it's far from universal compliance. So in Seattle, about half the people live in single family homes, and the participation rate is high, but only about 50% of what could go in that green bin actually does. This is single family, and this is tons of nitrogen. I could have shown it as tons of food scraps of the potential, but you can see the gray is going into the landfill and the green is what is actually captured. Now, this is with about 80 to 90% participation. You guys, Vermont, about 71% of the people live in single family homes. So we got room to grow here in Seattle. If you look at multifamily, it's even more sobering. The quantities of food scraps here are much lower in the multifamily homes, but the quantity diverted is about 10%. So until you have a good solid grasp, real counting and weighing people's trash, pat yourselves on the back, but don't consider it a job completely done. If it holds true that multifamily doesn't do as well as single family, you're in luck because only about 30% of the people in Vermont live in multifamily homes. Now, based on the survey that was done, a lot of people say that they compost in their backyard or give friends and neighbors their food scraps to compost. And that can be great. But I've been in Vermont. I went to college right near Bennington, not in Bennington, but near Bennington. And I know that you always have mud season. In fact, you should be fast approaching mud season, if not in it. Is that true?
Close.
I heard some voices there, and you sometimes have winter, right? We're having winter today, but sometimes you actually have a whole season. Now, the 46% of the people that either compost themselves or give it to neighbors that compost, this is our old compost bin. You can see we went very high tech. back in the day. Home composting is great in June when you're all excited about it and it's warm out. It's much harder to turn those piles when they're frozen. It's much harder to make yourself go outside and dump your food scraps when you got the wood stove going inside and it's muddy, cold, and nasty outside. So pile that's only turned occasionally can result in elevated methane emissions. A pile where you don't contribute everything, because who wants to go out there, is not nearly as effective. So now I'm going to go through different stages of talking about how you can polish what is already a hugely successful effort in Vermont. And so one of the things that you've seen all around in the market, and I know Casella is embracing this. There's a whole range of new new appliances that you never knew existed and that you never knew you needed, but having tried several of these can be transformative, and on a household level, they can be really helpful. They primarily dry and grind food scraps. This is from mill.com. And as your food scraps are 80% water, when you take that water out, all of a sudden, instead of this, you end up with a very small amount. Mill is one of a number of these. Food Cycler is another great one. One thing I like about Food Cycler and Mill is they don't say they make compost, whereas Lomi, another one of these, says it makes compost. Renical is another one that says they make compost. They dry and grind the food waste, and it's amazing because at the end of a cycle, you have a stable material that you can put in a bag that has minimal odor. I know that the mill gets hot enough to reach PFRP, which is another thing that's really nice about it. The emissions associated with these are electricity. If you're in Indiana where they burn coal, it's not so good, but in Vermont, you have a very low CO2e for power. So this is a tool to get people more aware of, well, let's phrase that a little differently, to make it easier for people to comply with food scrap diversion. It also works pretty well to stop contamination because you can see it in your bin. This is not compost. As I said earlier, one of the things I hate about Lomi, and Ron Alexander called this out at the last USCC meeting when the Lomi guy stood up. If you get this stuff wet again, and here's stuff from a food cycler from my house, got it wet again, came back, and it was moldy and stinky, and in a day or two, the fruit flies would have started. This is not compost. So for people to think it's compost because it looks kind of sort of like compost, you can get into trouble. But one of the things that's wonderful about it, and this has been certified, tested, and approved, it can be chicken food. And so for us, this is our dried food grounds. This is our neighbor's standard chicken feed. These are our neighbor's chickens. And this is my mill. You notice I don't have it in as lovely a place as in the ad. And the dog food is right in front, as is the old paint can. But this is what it looks like inside. This is the material. You'll get this from any of these devices. And this is my payback. We trade with our neighbor food scraps and we get hurt chicken eggs. And if you look at the EPA food pyramid, feeding animals is a little bit higher than compost or anaerobic digestion. And in Vermont, I think there's quite a few backyard chickens. So this could be a really good deal for homeowners. To encourage composting, to reduce contamination, to make the process easier year round, and to potentially make animal feed. Now, it also makes composting at home easier because you can store it till it's nice out. Now, you can also put this stuff directly into your soil, but you have to wait to plant it. Now, this is what this stuff is before it's dried and ground. This looks like soil, and it looks like you might want to plant into it. Would anybody, self-respecting gardener, put a seed into this? No way. So what you got to do is shovel it into your soil, come back in a month or two, depending on the season, and then you can plant. So that's how you can, one tool to increase participation. Another thing that I found is much of the focus on food scrap diversion, and on a policy level, this is certainly really important. It's been on methane avoidance. And so if you're selling this behavior change as a, boy, let's avoid methane, let's kill the world a little less quickly, that doesn't make you feel so good. But instead, what you could do is say, by diverting food scraps and using it as food for animals, or even better, food for the soil, you're also healing the earth. That's a message that can really resonate and make people really appreciate the good that they are doing. Regenerative agriculture is something people have now heard about, and that requires healthy soil. And the key to healthy soil is increased soil carbon. There's a Soil Health Institute now. Soil is by and large sexy now. There are books about soil. People are aware of soil. It's not sexy in a Sydney Sweeney kind of way. To show you how old I am, I had to ask my son who the Farrah Fawcett modern day equivalent was, and that's how I know who Sydney Sweeney is. But soil is sexy in a let's all help save the world, bring life back, and keep eating food kind of way, which to me has more longevity than either Farrah or Sydney. But that's just my opinion. There are movies about soil. Kiss the Ground was the first one. There's another one that's recently out. Woody Harrelson is telling you how wonderful soil is. That has some impact. Soil carbon sequestration here. So in other words, the time for soil is now. And when you sequester soil carbon, you get both the bang of a climate change mitigation strategy, and you get improved soil health. This is dryland wheat, a few hours from where I live and where I flush. This is the field that got the biosolids, and this is the field that didn't. And you can see this. You can see the difference in greenness. We've looked at satellite imagery. You can see the biosolids from space. And here you can see the enhanced productivity and enhanced soil health via the greenness of the vegetation from space. And that's pretty cool. Most of the standard ways to increase soil carbon, as we look in greater detail, they don't pan out with depth, and that's literally. Cover crops and crimson and clover, another great Tommy James song. There you go, another ageist reference. But typically, cover crops do really well for increasing soil organic carbon in the surface soil horizon. Study a few years back at UC Davis, long-term study, corn tomato rotation, where they used cover cropping plus or minus poultry manure compost and did a deep soil sampling. And corn tomato rotation, I had to put a picture in. These are my own little yellow cherry tomatoes. Anyway, with just the cover crop in the surface, boy, they got carbon storage. But when they sampled with depth, it turns out it was robbing the bottom to pay the top. They ended up with a net loss of soil carbon. But when you put poultry manure compost in there, you ended up across the whole depth of sequestering about 22 tons of carbon. That's not CO2. That's just carbon. To get CO2, you multiply it by a lot across the depth. So let me get the right button here. What studies are showing more and more is what's referred to as exogenous organic matter has panned out with depth as the best way to build soil organic matter. Here is one study, and it's based on a range of trials out of England. Carbon per hectare per year based on a cumulative 20-ton loading over 20 years. That's not a lot of material. Carbon from biosolids 0.38, municipal solid waste, 0.18, green waste and biosolids, 0.39, and bio waste compost times 0.42. These are all big numbers. This is per hectare per year. That's one study. Another study, and this was long-term field sites across Europe, they reported it a slightly different way, but the amount of the added carbon that stays put, biosolids 66, green waste compost 100%, MSW compost 82%. And here's some more aerial pictures of that dryland wheat study. You can see the fertilizer versus 3 tons per acre. You can see the difference in green, and you can see that with compost. So the key here is telling people, and it's true, that not only do you stop killing the planet, you start helping to heal the planet. And the best way to do that with soil is with compost. And you can see the CO2 equivalents, and how much more effective it is than cover crops. This is from a biocycle column. It's wonderful, wonderful stuff. So it's even wonderful enough that you're seeing states and agencies recognizing it, which is nice. California and Washington, 2 states that I know of that have soil health initiatives. Compost is an integral part of this. This is Washington State. This is Deirdre Griffin-Layu right here, who is in charge of the dryland wheat study that I was talking about. And they want to develop technical or other approaches to overcome existing barriers to increase organic inputs, compost, manure, biosolids, and biochar. That's pretty nice. What's even nicer is the USDA NRCS has a code 336 soil carbon amendment where they're paying farmers to use compost. This is a very nice thing. This is available in all 50 states. A simple soil test is involved. You have to see if it's being used, and you have to talk to your state extension agent to get them to use it if it's not being used, and outreach to farmers. But it's very nice that there's something on the books where you can get paid to use compost on a farm level. Anybody know who this woman is?
Nora.
Carrie Oceans, who's in the that's Nora, yeah. And those are some nice carrots that she's holding in her hands. So a recognition of the importance of soils is a strong motivation for people to compost and divert food scraps. And it's potentially a great way to sell more compost and get additional revenue from sales. Now, that was a way, these are 2 tools to get people to participate more. These new appliances and talking about composting as a way to heal rather than kill less quickly. Now I'm going to talk about ways as a compost industry, you can take advantage of this and maybe even make some more money, which is not always a bad thing. One of the things that we've done is look at a range of different blends that are catered to specific end users. And one of these end users is a home garden market. And this is Ryan Bachaika, who is a grad student who, for his master's thesis, grew a lot of petunias, and some grew very well, and some didn't do nearly as well. And he used different blends, and our gold standard here was a biosolids-based potting soil, and boy, did that grow nice petunias. But so did the yard waste vine and the biosolids, not so much with the biochar. And so if you make and test products for how petunias respond, how tomatoes respond, how lilacs respond, you can specialize and increase sales of certain products. Another thing that's worked is the growth of urban agriculture, community gardens. This is Tacoma. This is a survey we did looking at how big gardens were in Tacoma in the Harvest Pierce County program and how well they were used. And amazingly enough, there are a lot of community gardens in this region, and people like learning how to grow from their neighbors and visiting with their neighbors and sharing food with their neighbors in a community garden setting. Each of these community gardens gets as much of Tagro and as much yard waste compost as they want. This is Kristen McIver, another former student who is head of this program for Harvest Pierce County. The compost and the biosolids potting soil are all given away. Tagro, the Tacoma biosolids program, I think is the only program in the country that has regularly run out of their product, and that sales outside of the garden donations broke $1 million this year. So community garden donations is a great way to get information out and customers out about your product, especially if you make a product that works well. And so don't just say it's great because it meets all regulatory requirements and you get your tip fees. Make sure it's great because the plants grow well. Another column, and there are a couple of columns about this study. This is Toby Una, who worked on this. This was one of the plots that we use fertilizer, and right behind her you can see this is the plot where we use the biosolids compost mix. And if you're a gardener, which one would you use? It's the plants are not lying here. Okay, now, so how to get people to do this better, how to get you guys that compost commercially to make more money, how to get you guys that compost professionally to help the planet. One of the things aside from climate change, and in fact, in the planetary boundary study that came out a while back that is a little overwhelming, climate change, we're in bad shape, but not nearly as bad as we are in biodiversity loss, that I can't help you with, but in the nitrogen cycle. We are fixing so much synthetic nitrogen, and it's having a very bad impact. So if you start looking at sources of fixed nitrogen that's already here and not in the atmosphere, one of the big sources are biosolids and septic tank pump outs. Now, this is a different paper we did, and we looked at nutrient flows. This is Tacoma, where they had the community garden that I talked about and the biosolids program. It's so wonderful. They don't compost any of their food waste there. And if you look at how much nitrogen is in the food waste, this is an estimate. It's about 129, and I don't remember the units here. I think it's 129 tons per year. The city has a population of a couple of 100,000. If you look at the amount of nitrogen that's going into the wastewater plant, this was our estimate. This was the actual. Some is going into the biosolids, and a great deal is going into the effluent. So if you took all of this nitrogen and were somehow able to capture it, you would get enough nitrogen to fertilize all of the non-dairy, non-meat food crops for everybody in Tacoma. So basically, between the food scraps and what you pee and poop, you make enough fertility to grow all the vegetables and grains that you need each year. Now, in Vermont, you're doing pretty well considering where you are. Agriculture takes, this is from 2018, so PFAS had already hit the screen here, or hit the fan, so to speak. But you can see that the amount of the biosolids that has been landfilled has gone up 15% from 2004 to 2018, and the amount put to beneficial reuse has gone down. I know you are very close to ground zero for PFAS, and I know the Atlantic magazine just had another article about the horrors of wastewater. I also know that it's maybe 10 farms that have been terribly impacted in Maine. And I also know that this picture was taken very much to scare the crap out of you, literally and figuratively. This is a foggy March day. This is not a young, vibrant looking guy. This is not a gigantic, healthy cow. I know that this is scary and this can be tough, but our planet on a larger scale can be even scarier, especially when PFAS can be found in our bodies, in our bloods, in rain, in snow, in sleet, just anyway. So when if you're thinking about composting biosolids at all, this is a graphic from the California Association of Sanitary Agencies looking at the relative concentration, makeup, food packaging. If you want to reduce your PFAS exposure, the best option for you is not to stop using biosolids compost or food scrap compost. It's more to not eat at McDonald's anymore and to stop using foundation, because these, in our everyday lives, these materials have orders of magnitude more PFAS than any residuals that we might make. So this is a carrot on compost. And anybody would be proud of this carrot. You guys are really setting a model for the nation. Composting works well for so many things. You get rid of that methane, you build soils, you store carbon, and it makes the world a better place. To get that extra star, that A++, dry and grind appliances at home may be helpful. Marketing specific blends can also be helpful, and to help the planet think about working a little more with wastewater. And that's what I have. And so I'm going to stop sharing and see if there are questions.
Thank you so much, Sally. I do have some time for questions, but I will just also want to take a minute to remind folks that we do have a PFAS specific session this afternoon as one of our concurrent sessions. And it's also going to come up again later in the virtual program. So just so you have that reminder. And then we do have some time for questions. Maybe we'll start if there are any from the Zoom room, and then we'll move to the room and sort of bounce back and forth.
Yes, we have a few questions in the chat. One of them was just asking if you could share the link to the study about the cover crops.
I can send it to Natasha.
Yep. If you send it to me, I can, along with the recording and the slide deck, I can also post links to any of the studies that Sally shared.
Great.
Yeah, and I'm happy to send PDFs of the studies that we've done, but I have to tell you that it might be much more enjoyable to just read the columns than the studies.
A plug for columns over studies. Got it.
I'm just saying, it's anyway.
And then I have one question about the at-home food, quote unquote, composting products.
Don't
like
say
you
it.
mentioned.
Don't go down that road. Yeah,
I know. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm
the
trying
food
to
drying dehydrated.
Yes,
products.
the food dehydrators.
Yep.
You know, a comment was made that they're not really affordable in some homes. And so what other encouragement is there to facilitate composting in the winter?
So I will say that one thing that Mill did that I know about this because I've worked with them some, but they did a pilot in Tacoma, and Tacoma is a place where you pay as you throw. And so you have the potential, if you throw away less, to get a smaller bin and pay less. And that can, and in the case of Tacoma, they had the people that tried the mill were really happy and in fact reported that they paid less. So in a future case or in certain areas where you don't have regular pickups, you have to drive your material in to be recycled or to a transfer station, you can save on transport and you can save on tip fees. Worm composting is also great. I just saw that in the chat messages. For other than that, you know, I know home composting can be great. I also know that it's really tough in the winter, and it's really tough when the stuff is smelly and not so nice to deal with. So for me, we first got a food cycler 3 or 4 years ago, and it was really transformative. And so I go on.
Go ahead, Sally. Sorry.
I would think that over time, in various iterations, some of these are going to become the equivalent of dishwashers, something that you didn't know you needed, and then you get one. It's like, oh my, that's easier. And it turns out dishwashers save money and save water too.
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that we do have a section on the on-farm composting toolkit that has been developing on winter composting troubleshooting specifically. So if anyone wants extra resources for alternative ways to manage composting, they can reach out to me directly. So why don't we take one more question from Zoom, and then we'll see if there's questions in the room, and then we'll go back and forth a little bit.
Great. So this question is about what your definition of biosolids is specifically.
Yeah, it's a standard. It's centralized wastewater treatment. The solids produced after the material has been treated to reduce pathogens. Typically, if you have a septic system, you get it pumped and it's discharged into a wastewater treatment plant. Typical characteristics of the biosolids are fairly consistent. Depending on the treatment process, the percent nitrogen is usually between 4 and 7%. Percent phosphorus is between 1 and 3%.
Great, thank you. Any questions in the room? Yep, there's one right here in front.
Hi, thanks for your presentation, Sally. I was just curious and really interested in that kind of 50% stalling of your diversion rates in Seattle, where you've had that law for about 15 years of mandatory diversion of organics. We just saw from Emma that for the state of the state that it's kind of similar according to the updated study here in Vermont. And I was wondering if you have any ideas to break through that 50% or what might be causing that stall there.
And this is just me, so it's not scientific. I think that one of the issues is the green bin is outside your house and on the green. So I live in a multifamily. We have an apartment in Seattle, and we have a green bin, and there's a picture cover on the green bin about what can and cannot go into your food scrap bin, and that's really great to have that. But you want that in your kitchen when you're actually doing the separation. I think there's a misunderstanding or not full understanding about what can go in these, and that leads people to put stuff in the garbage or put it down the sink as opposed to putting it in the green bin. I think that the yuck factor still regularly plays in. I think it's a range of these things. And Seattle Public Utilities does have an online guide to what you can and cannot put into green compost bins, but it's not nearly as informative or as interactive as other apps for other things. So I think the interface needs to be in the kitchen, and I think it needs to be much more user-friendly.
Great, thank you. Any other questions from the room?
Hello, I've got a question about the methane emissions. And I mean, there's nothing good about methane emissions. Methane, they're just terrible things. But Walter Yenna, who is a climate scientist from Australia, has asserted that methane is very quickly broken down in the atmosphere as long as there's water moisture and ultraviolet light present. Now, that's a very broad assertion. I don't know how, you know, how relevant it is, but I was wondering if you could characterize just how much natural mitigation of methane emissions there are close to the Earth's surface, and as long as there's some sun.
So methane is a short-lived gas. It has a residence time of about 12 years is, I think, the average. And the 23 times as impactful as CO2 is based on a 100-year time frame. So a lot of people have argued that rather than express it as a 100-year time frame, it needs to be expressed as like a 25-year time frame, where all of a sudden methane goes from, instead of 23 times, to about 75 times as impactful as CO2. So while the climate scientist from Australia is correct that the atmospheric residence time is much, much shorter than other gases, that's reflected in the impact. And it's one of the deals with methane is it doesn't need a silver bullet genius MacArthur grant type Albert Einstein solution. It needs you to put your food scraps in a different bin, and for municipalities to have the nerve to enforce this. So that's a solution. It's a very easy solution to get rid of a short-lived climate gas that would have a very quick impact at minimal cost.
All right, one more question from the room, and then we'll check back in with the Zoom questions.
Hi, my name is Zoe. I'm from We Radiate. My question was, you showed a slide about how farmers can compost and they can use that in their farms. So I was wondering if you had any insight on what are the barriers and challenges currently that are facing farmers that is stopping them from composting more or using that as a fertilizer in their farms?
So on-farm composting is one thing that I know in some states there are restrictions on how much on-farm composting can take place and how much materials farmers can accept. When I was on the USDA committee on urban and innovative agriculture, one of the things that our committee recommended to the secretary was that on-farm composting be promoted and restrictions be lessened. One of the deals with using compost on a farm is it can be a very expensive process, and you don't necessarily get the nutrient bang as quickly as you would from regular fertilizers. The extension infrastructure, which a lot of farmers turn to, has been reluctant in many cases to recommend and to teach farmers how to appropriately use composts. So there can be restrictions for farmers who want to compost. There can also be knowledge gap limitations and financial limitations for farmers that prevent them from starting to integrate compost use into their standard practices.
Thank you. And I'll just say that's an excellent promotion for Thursday morning's virtual session, where we'll be talking about this exact topic in detail for a 90-minute session. So hopefully
and
you'll
I
be able
didn't
to join
even
us.
know. Look at that.
You didn't even know. It's amazing.
Right and left.
Right. All right. We're going to take a couple more questions from the Zoom room. Shannon?
Great. So one of these questions you touched upon a little bit with regard to your own experience in multifamily housing, with, as you mentioned, keeping, having the visual cues of the signage, having the assistance with separating appropriately in the home, having municipalities enforce upon this separation. Is there anything else you could share quickly about increasing food waste diversion in multifamily homes?
If I knew that answer, I could be rich now. Yeah, I don't. Behavior change is hard, and I don't think in a single family home you typically have a yard and you can get it. You can. It helps a lot with this stuff if you can take it and use it in your own garden and see the benefits. And multifamily are typically one extra step away from that. I mean, that is not necessarily the real full answer, but if I had a real full answer, boy, would I be raking in the consulting fees.
Thank you. I think you mentioned, upon a lot of the different things that would promote multifamily food scrap diet diversion. The next question I have is about your view on biochar, because it gets a lot of hype. And if you can share some pros and cons about combining it with compost.
So biochar was seen as, okay, this is a really stupid analogy, but I'm far away and I can't see the audience, so I won't be embarrassed. So I just got hyaluronic acid to stop my wrinkles, and I use my hyaluronic acid every day. Does it do anything? No, it doesn't do anything. But it's an easy thing, and I can smear it on, and I feel better. So char is basically being marketed as something that's going to stop my wrinkles for the soil. And to me, it's more expensive and does less than my little bottle of hyaluronic acid. Within compost, char as a specialty ingredient for certain things, yes, there you got something. So if you integrate a little bit of char into your compost, there are studies that show that you can reduce ammonia volatilization. That's a great thing. There are studies that show that to some extent you can reduce odors because char can do that. Charcoal does that. That's a great thing. So to think of char as the universal panacea that's going to make all soil healthy and young again, to me, that's a crock. But there are targeted specialty uses of char where it can be a very valuable ingredient. Thank you, Carrie. I saw that. I appreciate that thumbs up.
Why don't we have Stephen, a question from Stephen in the room?
Hi, Sally. Steve Wisbaum. Comment and a question. So my comment is that it's my observation that it's not just winter that makes composting, home composting difficult, but that for most people, they're not going to do the mixing of the browns and the greens. They're going to try and get it hot, which is basically impossible for home composting. And ultimately, it ends up being a habitat for rats. I hear bears, and I saw there was someone put up a slide that showed a rat. I think it's one of these sort of dark secrets of home composting that doesn't really get a lot of attention. So I really like this idea of these dehydration systems. And yes, they can save money if you're paying to have someone haul away. You're hauling up tremendously a lot less, and it's also not smelling. So that's just one comment about that. The other, some years ago, Will Brinton published a study on I think it was called the carbon footprint of compost operations, commercial compost operations. It was put it as a question: what is your carbon footprint of your compost operation? And so my recollection is he was referring, he did some work looking at the emissions from equipment and frequency of turning, and also just less turning, maybe producing less carbon emissions, because there are, CO2 emissions from composting. I'm just wondering if you were familiar with that, or it's been updated, other people have built on that work, and how compost operations could reduce their own emissions.
There's been a number of studies on fugitive gas emissions from composting. There's also been studies, and I've done some of these on equipment emissions. Equipment emissions tend to be minimal in comparison. Your real your emissions with staying power are fugitive gas because of the 23-time multiplier factor for methane. And the easy, cheap way to, your methane is mostly going to be an issue in a commercial facility in the first few days after you build a pile. When you have a higher moisture content and a higher potential for anaerobic conditions. An easy thing to do is cover that initial pile with finished compost. The microbes in the finished compost will oxidize the methane before it's released. So easy, and then you can just incorporate the finished material into the compost. Easy, cheap, very effective. We did a report for the USCC, Andrew Carpenter from Northern Tilth, who's going to be there later today. And I did something on VOC, volatile organic carbon, or volatile organic chemical emissions from composting, and covering with finished compost does wonders. It'll do that for VOCs. It'll also do it for methane. As for CO2 emissions during composting, CO2 you don't have to worry about because it's short-term carbon cycle, which means it's from the annual cycle of growth, decay, eating. And so compost is only a potential emitter for the fossil fuels you use or energy you use during the composting process, and also for fugitive gases. So CO2 doesn't count, and you can limit methane pretty easily.
Great, thank you. We have time for 2 more questions, maybe one from the room and one from Zoom. Anyone else in the room have a question? Yeah, right over there.
Hi, so you mentioned in your slide about PFAS food packaging. I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about any recommendations in regards to commercially composable packaging, plain paper food packaging, plastic packaging, or anything that you can recommend in that whole circus of packaging that is available. Thank you.
So before you go, Sally, I'm just going to say that is a huge question. And Sally, I'm certainly going to let you answer it, but briefly maybe. And I'll just let you know that we do have a compostable packaging session later in the week. We also have 2 more conversations about PFAS specifically, so we can get into more of the details at a later time in the program. But Sally, go ahead.
Yet again, plugging you more sessions coming up. Look at
I
that.
know, it's amazing.
Yeah.
What a program.
So I will say that I just submitted to Nora a 2-column and then another study that was presented by Tim O'Neill from ECS. So there'll be stuff in Biocycle very soon about the whole issue of compostable plastics and how well or not well they do fare in a pile and the challenges associated with them. A number of states, Washington being one of them, are limiting how much PFAS can be used in food packaging. And their limits are something like 100 parts per million, which, if you think about it, is 100,000 parts per billion. And if you think about the drinking water limits as parts per trillion, that's another 3 zeros. So packaging use of PFAS is still a huge issue. And so cook at home, and instead of using saran wrap, use a plate to cover the leftovers. There you have it.
Thank you so much. And these are big topics. I don't mean to push them aside, but it really takes more time than we have. All right, so one more question from Zoom, and then I think we'll wrap the session.
Yeah, the final question that we have on Zoom, I believe you saw it a few minutes ago, is about different amendments in compost and the value of them. Specifically, the question was about seaweed amendments. So do you have anything to share about the use of amendments in compost or soil?
So seaweed, I don't think it's, I mean, a woman at where I work is doing a test about seaweed as an amendment. I got to tell you, it's going to have a fair amount of sodium in it. Sodium isn't good for plants. And seaweed salad can be delicious, but until we get all of the food waste and food scraps and other easily land-based compostable materials into piles, I don't see a special need for seaweed. Sorry to, and I love swimming and I love the ocean, so this is not, and especially like
nothing
Vermont does
personal.
not have a lot of coastal property. There's not a lot of coastal property in Vermont. I would not go out of your way to get seaweed.
All right. Well, everybody help me thank Sally Brown for the keynote.
Have a wonderful rest of the conference.
All right. Thank you so much, Sally. And thank you as well to all of our Zoom participants. This actually concludes our hybrid portion of the program for today.